Welcome to the Lazy CEO Podcast, where Jim Schlecker, author of Great CEOs Are Lazy and founder of the CEO Project, features compelling experts and topics for CEOs of mid to large-size companies. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another Lazy CEO podcast. My name is Jim Schlecker. I am your host. I'm the CEO of the CEO Project. And today we have with us an awesome guest. I'm going to read his bio because it's like super impressive. So, one of the world's leading business thinkers, Dr. David Burkus, forward-thinking ideas and best-selling books are helping leaders and teams do their best work ever. He is the best-selling author of 4 books about business and leadership. His books have won multiple awards and have been translated into dozens of languages. Since 2017, Burkus is ranked multiple times as one of the world's top leading thought leaders. His insights on leadership and teamwork have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, USA Today, Fast Company, the Financial Times, Bloomberg Business Week, CNN, BBC, NPR, CBS, This Morning, and Mad Magazine. A former business school professor, Burkus now works with leaders from organizations across all organizations, including PepsiCo, Fidelity, Adobe, and NASA. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
By the way, that was the short version.
Yeah.
So we could have been here a while. It was mercifully short. So David, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what your space is, where your expertise is, where you help people.
Yeah. So the phrase I use all the time, I think you already read it, is that I help leaders and teams do their best work ever. I think 2 things fundamentally. One, that work is central to our lives, right? That even if we had universal basic income and everybody was being paid some of it, most people would still want to do something, make some contribution to the world, et cetera, right? So work is central to our lives. Yep. And that work is teamwork. Your experience of work, whether or not you're engaged or motivated, whether or not you actually want to put your whole effort into something, is shaped less so by broad company culture and more by the teams that you're on. And for a leader, for a CEO, this is your job, right? Whether you're the CEO, whether you're a middle manager, no matter whatever team you lead, you're responsible for the culture on that team. And so that's what I focus on predominantly, is teaching teams and teaching team leaders how to have a culture that actually unlocks high performance, unlocks motivation, allows them to be more innovative, et cetera. So that's been at the core of my work for, I feel old saying this, almost 2 decades now.
Wow. But I've got socks that are 2 decades old.
Yeah, I know.
Don't worry about it. It's not that old.
That's the irony, right? Is you feel old. Like the moment you start to feel like, wow, okay, I'm getting old. The people who felt that like 10 years ago are like, you're kidding me, right? Like,
Right.
Old is always 10 years older than you really are, right?
Totally. So let me just go down that culture thing, because that's a big topic that people talk about, is culture management. There's 3,000 papers on that topic, right? And yet your comment is culture is experienced locally. Mm-hmm. And so how do we, as leaders of scaled organizations, deal with the fact that culture is experienced locally, not globally? Feels like we don't have the levers of control on that one. So how do you help people with that?
Yeah. And this is something that I think most intelligent leaders hopefully knew before the pandemic, but that the pandemic made glaringly apparent, right? When we took everything that couldn't be done on site and asked to do it remotely, or asked to do it from home, it became obvious, right? Because prior to that, we heard, I don't know, you remember the early 2000s, early 2010s, when we talked about culture, we talked about free food and dry cleaning and all of these, fun events and all of that sort of stuff. We thought we were pulling the levers of culture. We really weren't, right? Because even then, culture was local. So what do you do to scale culture? In my opinion, you teach leaders at all levels what a great team culture looks like, and you make them responsible for the one on their team. I look at it this way. You think of it as sort of concentric circles, right? Yep. What do we as an organization want to be about? What are our values, mission, vision, et cetera? And then you have to teach every leader at every level to do the same thing in a smaller circle inside that larger circle. You run into problems when you let leaders do something that's against sort of the corporate-wide values, the company-wide values and culture. But as long as it's inside of it, every team is going to have a stronger culture that is still a little bit different from other teams inside the organization, right? So culture is everybody's job in this result. It's not just that senior leader job. And you teach them specifically, like, there's all sorts of, like you said, there's decades of research on corporate culture and the effect of culture, et cetera. But specifically, when you dive down into team culture, it gets a little narrower and easier to focus on. There's only a few, if you look at whether it's Anita Williams-Woolley or Project Aristotle, there's only a few elements that explain a great team culture. And so it becomes a little bit easier to teach that to every given team leader, what they're responsible for.
Interesting. So let's go there for a minute. Say I'm a CEO. What are the factors that make a great team culture that I should be thinking about and teaching?
Yeah, and here's where you and I might get really, really nerdy. And so we're going to try.
I'm in, man. Let's go.
Because there's all sorts of lists, right? And they all have slightly different definitions and slightly different names, et cetera. I think probably the easiest one for people to get their head around is probably Google's Project Aristotle study, which had 5 factors. Charles Duhigg ran with that and just said it's all about psychological safety, but ignoring the other 4 factors. They also matter. I think there's a lot, when you start to look at it, I think there's actually a lot of overlap there. And so I took all of that literature plus a lot of the other teams, researchers out there, and I boil it down to 3. If you look at the overlaps, I boil it down to 3, which I call common understanding, psychological safety, and pro-social purpose. Now, psychological safety, you're probably familiar with. Again, like I said, it's in the Project Aristotle. It's too big to be ignored. It's too important to teams to be ignored. But the other 2 are kind of new terms.
Let's just do that. Let's just touch on it for a second.
Okay,
What are the elements under, just briefly for those that may not, what does that mean? Sounds like a very a very Gen Z kind of comment. I need psychological safety, but like it's real. So what does it really mean?
Yeah. And what's funny is I think it's important to distinguish this between, like, if you think about millennial, Gen Z, et cetera, we tend to start to equate psychological safety with safe spaces, and that's actually not what we're talking about.
That's what I'm after. Good.
What we're not talking about is a place where you'll never confront a dissenting opinion. You'll never have anything. No, we're actually talking about the opposite. We're talking about an environment where people feel safe to state their dissenting opinions, where there's Amy Edmondson would call it a climate of mutual trust and respect. And those are 2 different things that we probably have to break down. But in doing that, when you have a high level of trust and respect, you can have task-focused conflict. You can have people speaking up when they disagree. You have a much more ethical team because people will be you don't even use the term whistleblower. You're just pointing out to the team, hey, I think this is wrong. I don't think we should go down this road. Right. And you get a team that's more willing to admit their failures. And I think that's probably the biggest element of psychological safety that has nothing to do with safe spaces and that sort of thing. I mean, by the way, there's no such thing as safe spaces. There's only safe people. But that's a whole other monologue. You learn from failure because you cultivate a team where people trust everyone else on the team is not going to leverage their mistakes and their screw ups to try and step over that person into a promotion. Instead, we go, okay, we had a learning moment here. We failed. Failures happen from time to time. And as long as you're not grossly incompetent and failing all the time, as long as this isn't a performance issue, then the failure is really just a learning moment. Let's talk about it and let's learn from it. And I think that's why that reason, more than any of the others, is probably the reason it's so crucial to a high performing team, to a great team culture, is that you need to learn from those failures.
Yep. There's Kim and Marburn who wrote Blue Ocean, but they wrote another paper about procedural justice.
Mm-hmm.
And it follows on this line of, I feel like I was heard. I feel like my input was considered in a procedurally fair way, right?
Right.
It was not unduly, and that gives people ability to commit.
Right.
So go on to the other 2 factors. I don't want to spend all the time on this.
Yeah. So, and the other 2 are common understanding and what I call pro-social purpose. And I'll be honest, these are terms I had to invent, not because I want to like stamp my intellectual property all over it, which unfortunately a lot of academics do. I'm not trying to relabel an existing psychological term, but because there was a lot in there, right? Common understanding is how well we have clarity of roles, clarity of responsibilities, how well we have dependability, and we can trust that other people on the team are going to do what they say they do, but also how well we understand the other teammates, right? How well we have clarity of their personality differences, their work preferences, right? Like probably the first thing that causes frustration on a team is this sense that, everybody just needs to be doing things the way I want them to be done, right? You get so much frustration on a team just because people are fighting for people to follow their favorite process. It's never going to happen. Right. You look at a tool as simple as email. It's been around for 50 years and no one can agree how long an email is supposed to be, how many main points, what the rules for reply all are. And you're not going to convince everyone to treat this tool the same. But you can understand the different preferences on your team and you can understand who keeps a different calendar. And so they send late night emails and you don't feel threatened by that, et cetera, because you just get that that's their calendar. So you get a lot more collaboration because when you understand the preferences of your team, you know how to speak to that person better. You know what to expect from them. You collaborate with them a whole lot better when you understand not just what's expected of you, but you understand the people who are also working alongside of you. So I sort of, it's a catch-all term. It encompasses, if you want to go nerdy, collective intelligence from Anita Williams-Woolley, shared understanding from Martine Haas and Mark Mortensen. It's sort of a catch-all term there, but it's one of those kind of core elements and you build them all the same way. So when you get to the tactical, that's why we kind of combined a lot of different terms there.
You know, I did some research on, global virtual teams, and I think I talked to you about that at one point. And I would almost parse those two things into the technical matter of like, okay, David has marketing and Jim has this and she has that. And then there's the relational, and people really short sell the relational element, particularly in virtual teams, which is really, really hard. So it's like the hard and the soft elements within what you just talked about, both being important, right?
Yeah.
When David sends an email and he's snippy, that's just how David writes.
Right.
Like, he's not being mean. He's not being, that's how he is. Right. And it's cool. Right. That's not technical. That's me knowing you. Which is a different feature. So
yeah, exactly right. So for each of these three elements, I actually tried to break it down 2 more because I'll let you in on a little secret. The real reason I tried to get it to 3 is that 3 is easy to remember than like Project Aristotle had 5, other lists have 7. No one's going to remember all of those. But if I can get 3, you can remember 3. And then each has a subset. And the subsets I use for common understanding are clarity and empathy.
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
Clarity of roles, responsibilities, like what you said, the technical, and then empathy is the personal, right? Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Larry Bossidy used to say that people can only remember 3 things. He ran Allied Signal. He's like, I only talk about 3 things. So like, why don't you go to the third element? Now that we know there's 3, what's the third element?
Yeah. So the third element is what I call pro-social purpose. And it's essentially meaning and impact. It's whether we feel like we're making a contribution to work that benefits others. And I think that's kind of a key distinction from where a lot of the popular literature on purpose has been over the last 15 years or so. We become obsessed with this question, why people need to know why they do what they do, et cetera. And that's not wrong. The problem is when you look at the research, right, on human motivation and in all of the like self-determination theory and others, what you find is outside of intrinsic motivation, which is just the desire to do the task because you enjoy it. The next most powerful is what Adam Grant, Francesca Gino, and others call pro-social motivation, right? So meaning that we're motivated to do work because we know it will benefit others, because it has this sort of pro-social element to it. And so I think the big question leaders need to answer, and this is why it's also important at a team level, is they need to answer the question, who's benefiting from the work that we're doing? Not why do we do what we do, but who is served by the work that we're doing. And that varies by every single team. I mean, yes, there are customers and stakeholders for a whole organization, but some teams' entire who is actually internal. I work in this support role. And so my job isn't to serve the customer directly. I serve the people who serve the customer or in some other thing, right? I do a lot of work with accounting firms, right? And they are like, I mean, nobody really likes the accountants. No offense, but their work is vital. Their work is vital to people inside the organization. So their who is actually internal. And that's why I think every team needs to really clarify that. Who is that person that's serving? What's the pro-social element of why you do what you do? And the teams that have and it's clear cut, they're more motivated for sure on an individual level, but we also see they're more bonded together. I mean, this goes back to like Musafer Sharif and superordinate goals and that whole idea that when we have that clear cut who, we actually feel more united as a team to do what we need to do in order to serve that person.
Yeah, and I found, maybe particularly in accounting, but they don't know who they're serving. Funny enough, in that case, they think they're serving accounting purity. Right? Like the field, I'm serving it by being true to my field. And you go, hang on a second, cowboy or cowgirl, you're serving me who needs the information and in an appropriate way. That's your job. And they forget it. And it becomes a real problem when they do. So what gets in the way of these three things? I mean, gosh, they sound like super great. Like do that and you're like, so why isn't everybody doing it? What makes it hard?
Yeah, well, practice, I think, for one, right? Culture, fundamentally, best definition of culture I've ever heard is people like us do things like this, right? So there's a do element to it. It's the habits, it's the norms of behavior, it's the routine ways that we operate. And so sometimes you have those things fall apart for a myriad of different reasons. I mean, probably the biggest one is you just have a team leader that lacks total self-awareness about their own actions and how their own actions might degrade from psychological safety, or might not create clarity of a person, might not create empathy, et cetera. But then the other is we just don't know how to kind of live that out. Like a great example, right? So a lot of times we're trying to build empathy on a team, which is part of that common understanding that we talked about. What we'll do is we'll do a team building activity, or we'll take a personality test, and then we'll just talk about our differences. Well, that doesn't really translate into how we're going to act different tomorrow. Right. So when I work with teams, one of the things I try and do is skip that. That might come out eventually. But I say, let's build a team charter. Let's create some norms, some rules of the road, right? Some simple, like, what are our guidelines? What are reasonable hours to contact each other? What are reasons to call a meeting versus an email? What's a reasonable amount of time to wait for an email response? Like little things, but then also big things. How do we want to give each other feedback? And when you refocus the conversation on how are we going to act around each other, you get those personality differences anyway. People talk about all of their different work preferences, but what you end up with is a clear set of norms. Okay, we commit to acting this way. And that's what actually changes culture over time. It's great to change minds, but culture is shaped by the behaviors we do on a regular basis. And I think a lot of times, we look at those three and we go, great, got it. Okay, that's awesome. But it's how you put it into practice that matters more. This new book, Best Team Ever, is the first book I've ever written where every chapter has more words about doing than about the research, which is weird for me. I'm a recovering academic, but that's the realization. If we're going to talk about culture, we need to talk about what you do.
Yeah. It's an interesting intervention. People think about, talking about bias for action, or talking about customer first, or talking about whatever elements of culture you want to have across the whole organization. But I think in the intervention of, let's get really explicit. How are we going to act in this situation? Let's agree that, and then hold ourselves accountable to it.
Yeah.
Is a very interesting way of intervening in culture. I've not really heard that before. That's very cool.
And you see it in the other ones as well. Like, so for psychological safety, right? I said before, if you use Edmondson's definition, it's a context, a climate of mutual trust and respect. It's that second part where most teams fall apart, right? We can do trust falls or whatever, and try and we can pay lip service to that you should trust the team. But the first time I speak up and offer a different opinion, and you tell me, we tried something similar 5 years ago before you were here and it didn't work, or that sounds like too expensive, or I don't think that'll work here. Instead of having me feel heard, respected, having me feel listened to, like you were saying earlier, procedural justice, having me feel that's a respect piece. That's a do. And if I don't do that and teach my team to do that, then as soon as that person steps out in trust and that trust isn't respected, it's gone. Yeah. And now we've lost psychological safety on the team. So it's much more about that do and teaching that do than anything else.
Can you just teach the leaders to model it, or do you have to actually go down and teach at the local level? In other words, can I teach a leader to go, when somebody has an idea, no matter how dumb it is, right? You're going to say, that's an interesting idea, David. Let's flesh that out. I mean, are we going to go down that path, or are we going to go, how do I get it down into the organizational level, down at the team level, so they can experience it? Is it leader only, or is it everybody?
Yeah. So more is caught than taught, right? You can certainly train it to everybody, but if they don't see it from the leader of their team, they're not going to mimic it. Christine Porath from at Rutgers, probably the world's most respected researcher on respect, right? On civility in the workplace, et cetera. When you look at her surveys and her research, one of the things she finds consistently is the number one reason for uncivil behavior or disrespect on a team is a lack of positive modeling from leadership, right? In other words, my leaders don't treat me like this. So I just thought this is how we act in this organization, right? In contrast, when you have leaders that really model that, and we've all had probably one of those, as long as your career's maybe more than like 5 years, you've had one of those leaders that models that, and you know the difference it feels like right? And you begin to emulate that over time. So I usually start with that team leader. I think it's important to have the conversation at a team-wide level, but if you're not getting modeling from that team leader, then it doesn't matter what I train the rest of the team on. They're not going to follow those rules when they get back to the office or the virtual office or wherever.
I think in either case, if you've got, great leadership and aligned to values and culture, and you're an outlier in a negative way, right? Like you're a dirty dealer, or if you've got abusive, difficult leadership and you try to do it right, if you will, right? Be collaborative, be trusting, be either one of those. There's friction in between either of those states that we could define, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think the former is really that CEO's job is to pay attention to, right? You can try and shape culture company wide, but the best thing you can do is watch how the culture on all the other individual teams are, right? Take your engagement data and break it down at a team specific level. And when you have teams that are scoring significantly lower than others, figure out why, figure out what's going on in that culture of the team. And you might have to invite that leader to be toxic somewhere else, right? The latter, right, is where team leaders, I think, can create sort of a pocket of excellence. Now, it depends on the organization, right? But if you're like, I do some work with retail organizations, and that's a great example. You can have a general manager of a specific retail location with a great culture inside of a largely toxic organization. That happens sort of all of the time. The inverse can be true too. You can have an individual retail store that's just horrible to work for. When you're talking about teams inside like a large corporate office, 1,000 employees, 500 employees, whatever, it's a whole lot harder. And really your kind of pocket of excellence is probably a little more of a human shield while you all devise your escape strategy, right? That's probably the only thing that's going to be all that useful.
So I used to look at turnover data pretty closely. Yes, engagement data, but turnover data. And when I had a pocket of turnover, particularly of high performers, known high performers turning over, I think I wrote an article about it. It said, you don't have a culture problem, you have a manager problem. You just track it back. Where's the point of connection? There's a manager who's not getting it done, which is why those people are leaving. And they're damaging the organization consequently. Just go down. Let's say I do hold people accountable to supporting the culture at the team level, and I got somebody who doesn't. You said it very cutely, like invite them to perform elsewhere. But like, really, what do you do? Let's run down that track. Somebody's not signing up for the program. They're not acting appropriately.
Yeah. So my advice to leaders is not to sound like the academic, but it depends. I think it depends on level and potential. Right. Level in the organization, meaning, is this a lower level? Is this a frontline manager? Is this an individual retail store? Okay. It's a whole lot easier to put them on a generic performance improvement plan, give them a little bit of 360 feedback, tell them it needs to improve. And if it doesn't, get rid of them, right? If it's a higher level, it's going to be harder to do that. And that's where, and then also if it's a person that's a high potential, but also toxic, that's where you might want to lean towards a more coaching role, right? Specifically, like I'll show my own bias here. Marshall Goldsmith is a friend and mentor to me. So I'm a big fan of stakeholder-centered coaching, right? The idea that you're doing feedback on this individual leader from everybody at 360, you're giving them that feedback, and they're the ones that get to determine whether or not this person has changed, right? Because if you're the leader above and they're telling you they've changed and nothing changes from the people they actually lead, okay, like, I'm sorry, we gave you everything we can. You're sort of gone, right? So level and potential really determine it, whether it's a simple performance improvement plan, here's the behaviors we need to see change, otherwise you're out, or whether it's a longer term coaching thing. And it really kind of varies based on those two things. I obviously the coaching one works a whole lot better, but there's situations where inviting that person to be successful somewhere else or toxic somewhere else is the cheaper, easier strategy. And then there's situations where it's much that would actually be more cost intensive because they're so high up in the organization. It's going to take so long to replace them, et cetera, that I think you want to kind of give that coaching a shot. Now, I'd love to be a naive optimist and say everybody can change with coaching, but if you could tell, my bluntness here is from a bit of experience. Right?
Yeah. Right. Maybe a couple of thoughts on that. One is Netflix has the view that they call them brilliant jerks, right? High performers that are toxic.
Yeah.
They don't give them a break. They just exit them. Period, right? Because too damaging to team performance. And I think the other is that I have a friend who says, it's an old quote, but the graveyards are full of indispensable people. There's nobody who's indispensable. You cannot get caught in that loop of, oh my gosh, she's so high up. She knows so much. She's been here so long. I know she's a horrible human being, but we got to keep working with her. No.
Yeah.
You just get rid of them, and
Yeah,
it'll stink for a while, but you got to do it.
Yeah, no, I
leaders, they're looking at you. If you don't make the move, they go, "What's wrong with David? Right? Why isn't he doing it?"
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the difference is how long you give them, right? I think you give everybody a chance. Some people, depending on level and potential, get a longer chance and a more robust chance than others. But yeah, you can't allow that. We talk about that in my second book, in Under New Management. There's a whole chapter on teams that are allowed to like give people a probationary time and then actually choose and vote on who gets to stay, not even at a leader level, but every individual team level.
Wow.
And this was an idea. It started at Whole Foods back when Whole Foods wasn't part of Amazon, run by John Mackey and others. And one of the things John Mackey said is that a team doesn't really bond, doesn't really turn into a high performing team until they have the difficult conversation of letting a team member go, right? Because if you say you have standards here, but you tolerate behavior here, guess what? Your standards are actually here, right? And a team, until they actually say, no, I'm sorry, we can't tolerate that, it's not until that happens that the standards actually get up to where they say they're supposed to be.
No, I like that. So team decides. That's a big, power shift for a lot of CEOs.
Yeah, no, I agree. Can you tell I'm very team oriented? Can you tell that? Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's all good. So maybe we'll just sort of wrap up on this, David. What would be, if I put you in front of one of our CEOs that we work with, and $30 million to $1 billion, middle market, small medium market, I guess you would call it, not Pepsi, right? What would be the 3 pieces of advice you would give them?
All right. So you told me 3, and there's 3 elements of culture, right? So I'm gonna give you one for each.
I wasn't
right?
4. 4.
well, so the number one thing I would do is I would encourage that leader, and I do this with a lot of businesses that are right in that size. That leadership team needs to have a team charter, a ways of working document, et cetera. The challenge when you get to that size is that leadership teams cease to be teams most of the time. And they actually turn into a little council of everybody reporting out on what the team they lead is. But they themselves need to be that team, right? So number one is, let's do that ways of working document. Let's talk about how we're going to actually collaborate, how these meetings are going to run.
As an executive team.
As an executive team, yeah. Because again, when you're starting out, executive team, the 2 or 3 people who are senior leaders feel like a team. It's when you get to the level you're describing that the executive team ceases to feel like that, because everybody's got their own little kingdom, their own little responsibility.
It's representation, right? No longer a team. Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah. So that's thing 1, right? Is let's not even worry about lower teams. Let's just have you start working as a team, and then more will get caught, right? The number 2 thing would be around psychological safety. I stole this from Julian Treasure. He has this great acronym for how to model active listening, and that respect piece he calls RASA, R-A-S-A. Receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. And I think when you're in a leadership role, people start sharing their opinion and you think they're coming to you for advice. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, doesn't matter. You still need to make sure they feel heard. And so when they're talking to you, receive that, make that eye contact, right? Nod your head, appreciate, say those little things you agree with. Yes. Yeah. Those little things that show you're in it, right? Before you say anything, summarize what you just heard them say. And then before you offer any statement, ask a question, even if that question is as simple as tell me more. Right. So that's thing 2. You can go a lot towards building psychological safety just by teaching leaders to model that one behavior. Right. And then the 3rd thing around pro-social purpose is I would have deep conversations about who is served by the work to do. My favorite thing to do with executive teams is I'll ask each individual person on the executive team to play a game I call the It's a Wonderful Life test, right? You remember the movie It's a Wonderful Life, guy's going to commit suicide. Clarence
George Bailey, who doesn't know it? Yeah.
Right. So I think a lot of internal teams, we were trashing accountants earlier, lovingly trashing accountants earlier. But I think a lot of teams can get a pretty solid understanding of who is actually served by their work by running that same test. If our whole department was gone tomorrow, let's say we were this is gruesome, but let's say we were on a retreat and our bus fell into a ravine and we're gone.
Oh my God.
I just looked, it's a wonderful life, right? Let's just say we all got recruited to work somewhere else. If we just disappeared, how would that affect the rest of the organization? And in that answer are clues to who is actually served by the work that you're doing, and the stories you need to be telling to keep your team motivated and keep them recognizing that they're making a contribution. I get it. It's gruesome.
No.
But figuring out what damage the vacuum created by you leaving causes is a really great way to sort of back your way into who your work truly serves, who's truly benefiting when you do a great job.
I love that. I think that's a great personal question too, right? If you were gone, who would notice?
Yeah.
My family, yeah, right. So that's great. David, this was phenomenal. Just knowledge all over the place. Really a different way of thinking about culture and intervention. I really appreciate that. Your book, when did it come out?
So it is out in May. So it has yet to come out. I sent you an early copy of it. Cover's done, etc. But it'll come out in May.
Okay. So the title?
Best Team Ever. I know,
Best
not all that
Team
creative.
Ever, and where can we buy it?
And anywhere you love buying books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. If you go to davidburkus.com, there will be it would be impossible to ignore when it launches.
Okay, awesome. So make sure you all pick up a copy of David's book. Obviously, this times 10, much more knowledge on a very important topic, I think. And then maybe last question, David. What do you do for fun?
So for the last 17 years, I've trained, practiced, coached, competed in an esoteric martial art called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. About an hour from now, I'm headed to the gym for a lunch break training session. And so that's probably, I don't golf. It would take too much time, etc., time away from Jiu-Jitsu. So that is probably, it's a really weird sport. It's like full contact yoga, but that's what I do for fun. Is
this like the Gracie family, that whole thing?
Yep.
It's just not yoga. This is damaging other human beings on purpose.
Yeah, but first of all, you have to be pretty flexible.
Yes.
There's a mindfulness component. You can't really be thinking about your stresses at the office when someone's trying to choke you unconscious, right?
Yep.
And breathing is really important. So there is a lot of overlap. It's just full contact yoga.
I love it. Okay. So watch for David on your next MMA fight. He will be the first doctor to ever win an MMA title. So David, this was phenomenal. Really appreciate your time. It was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate it. This podcast is brought to you by the CEO Project. At the CEO Project, we work with CEOs to help them grow their business. And our members represent billions of dollars of revenue and profit. And frankly, amongst all of us, we've probably made every mistake in the book, including some you haven't made yet. So if you want to learn from the experience of a bunch of really seasoned CEOs, we're a great place to hang out. In this podcast, what you're going to hear are some of those ideas, concepts, and things that are just going to help you on your journey. If you want to find out more, reach out to us at theceoproject.com, or you can contact me personally at jim@theceoproject.com. Happy listening.
Thanks for listening to the Lazy CEO podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes, and check out our website, www.theceoproject.com.